Todos podemos contribuir a la cultura de la legalidad, desarrollando un pensamiento crítico sobre las consecuencias que conllevan nuestras acciones individuales, que afectan directamente a la legalidad, el Estado de Derecho y la convivencia en sociedad. Existe evidencia de que los países donde se respeta el Estado de Derecho muestran mejores tasas de crecimiento económico frente a las economías con un Estado de Derecho débil. Asimismo, los indicadores del Estado de Derecho tienen una correlación directa con los niveles de inversión y crecimiento del empleo de los países. A continuación, escucharemos al doctor Roy Godson, quien enfocará su participación al impacto económico de la cultura de la legalidad. Pero antes, les comparto su semblanza. El doctor Roy Godson es profesor emérito de Estudios Gubernamentales de la Universidad de Georgetown y líder en el desarrollo de una cultura que apoya al Estado de Derecho. Por más de una década ha analizado prácticas internacionales y trabajado en los Estados Unidos, América Latina, así como en Medio Oriente en la implementación de programas para líderes gubernamentales y no gubernamentales que han sido exitosos en la promoción de una cultura de la legalidad. En 1993 fue elegido presidente de la organización educativa no gubernamental National Strategy Information Center. Por más de 40 años, el Dr. Godson ha desarrollado y dirigido programas educativos y de capacitación en varios continentes y ha brindado amplia asesoría a gobiernos, empresas, organizaciones internacionales y de la sociedad civil. Demos un fuerte aplauso al Dr. Roy Godson.
Well, thank you very, very much for this opportunity to be with you today, and I'm very grateful to Coparmex for organizing this forum that we're participating in today. It's a pleasure to be back also in Monterrey. I've been fortunate to be able to be in Monterrey and other cities in Mexico and Central America and Colombia for the past 10 years. You have all been so hospitable and kind, and with my laziness, I have benefited from your hospitality, but I'm afraid I have not learned very much Spanish. I'm particularly grateful, though, that we have a good interpreter, and many of you speak English so well that I'll be able to benefit from this, and I thank you, though, for your patience. The subject today is developing a culture of legality, and I want to put forward a thesis about the development of culture of legality. I would like to suggest today that those cities and those regions that have been able to develop a culture of legality have benefited enormously in their quality of life and the economy of those regions. We have seen that some societies have been able to change in a remarkably short period of time to develop a much higher degree of the culture of legality. We can review, and I propose to do that with you, review some of the ways that they were able to make this transition. We can understand a little bit of what it takes, and we've also just had some discussion about what it takes to make this transition in the remarks of General Naranjo. It won't be easy to make the transition. It isn't easy to make the transition, but I must say, from my travels to and from Monterrey, I do see some very positive signs here. And although there's a way to go, I do think that actually you are beginning to actually make some of the transition pointers that will enable you to be able to do this if you continue. I would like to suggest, however, though, that the business community is absolutely essential if this progress is to be continued. You can make a difference, and we'll come to this in the discussion. Let me begin with first a little bit of discussion of what is the culture of legality. The term is now being used here regularly. I don't know if you know that 10 and 11 years ago, there was no term culture of legality. It's a relatively new concept. It's not that some people had not developed it. It's just that we didn't know what it was that they did to transform some of their cities and regions. But let me begin with a definition that was used at the beginning of the program. The culture of legality is when the majority of people in a city or a society decide that the rule of law is the best way of conducting their business in that society, conducting their lives in that society. The overwhelming majority, not everyone, but the overwhelming majority of people believe that the rule of law is the best way to do this. Now, that begs the question a little bit, because I'm saying they believe in the rule of law, but what is the rule of law? And I don't want to be too academic about it, but I do think one has to have a fairly clear idea about what is a relatively complex concept, the rule of law. So let me take a few minutes just to talk about some of the characteristics of the rule of law, which we are asking the majority of people to believe in if they are going to make this transition that we're talking about. Let me just give you a few characteristics of the rule of law. The first, and I don't think the first one here will be controversial at all. I think, in fact, I hope it's not boring to you, but I think it's essential that we know these characteristics, because we, you, and others who want to help you and work with you on these matters are going to have to persuade people about the rule of law. And most people don't know about the rule of law. After all, no one is born with an understanding of the rule of law. You have to learn about the rule of law. So what are some of the key characteristics? Now, the first one is the rule of law is the equality principle, that everybody is to be treated equally under the law. Everyone. No one is to be above the law, and no one is to be below the law. Everybody is to be treated equally according to the law. There's nobody who has connections, who has wealth, who has power, who is to be regarded as exceptional to this principle. And there are not that many societies in the history of the world that have had this equality principle in practice. It took hundreds, if not thousands of years to be able to come up with this kind of an idea, and then to be able to actually create and institutionalize such an idea as the equality principle. A second principle, it's key, is that the population must have an ability to make the rules in the society. They have to have the ability to make the rules, which we associate with democracy and ability to participate in the making of the rules, but they also have to have the ability to oversee the implementation of the laws. They have to have enough transparency in that society that they know what's happening with the implementation of the laws. And then finally, under this second principle, not making the rules, not only making them, and not only knowing how they're being implemented, but also being able to adapt or change the rules as they see is useful in their society. Now, just these two principles alone embody a lot of ideas and a lot of important ideas. But I think when we talk about the rule of law, we have to be a little clear about what it is that we're talking about. The rule of law is not just ethics, it's not just values, it's not just a slogan. It's particular principles, and these two principles are essential ingredients. If we had more time, and you want to, we could talk about other elements of the rule of law, but I think these two are very important. and are essential in being able to then develop a culture of legality. A culture of legality then is where, as I said, the majority of people believe in these principles. They are willing to restrain themselves and not behave in ways that are not in accordance with these two principles. That is to say, people agree to bind themselves to follow these principles even when it may not be in their short-term interests. And I'm a particular person who finds binding myself to obey the speed laws very difficult. I don't know about you, but I find there are a lot of laws which I'm uncomfortable with, I don't want to follow. But if I believe in the rule of law and I believe in the culture of legality, I have to bind myself not to disobey the law. A believer in the rule of law believes also that others in the society also have to be bound. You have to agree that your neighbors won't do this, and they have to agree they won't do it. And they also have to agree that the state won't do it, that the state will be bound by these rules. The state, the government, no matter how high up, has to be bound by these rules. Now, if you can accept that you're going to follow these rules, and you're going to expect this behavior from your fellow citizens, who are also have to be bound by the rule, then you become somebody who becomes a believer and a supporter of the culture of legality. But it does no good just to say we want to have a culture of legality without realizing that you have an obligation. We all have this obligation. Those of us who want to live in a rule of law system, a rule with rule of law principles, must agree to these ideas. Or to put it another way around, just to give an example, to illustrate it. To say you believe in the culture of lawfulness means that you basically swear, you accept the obligation, never to give or take a bribe. It's really simple, and it boils down to that I can boil it down to that one principle. And ask yourself, don't answer it now, but ask yourself, have you ever given or taken a bribe to get what you need for your business, for your family, for yourself? And if you have, which many of us have done, we have to agree that we reject that behavior. We have to say that this is not acceptable. And if you can't accept that principle, I would say, then you are not really a believer in the rule of law, and you are not a believer in the culture of legality. So if you're willing to make this restraint, and you're willing to hold others up to this restraint, the next sort of step would be to ask yourself, what are the benefits of the rule of law? Now, many of you, I'm sure, believe in the rule of law. And presumably you agree to follow the restraints that it entails. But if you had to go and explain this to your children, or to someone else's children, or to the institutions in the city, are you prepared actually to defend the principles of the rule of law on the grounds that it leads to a better society? What about it? What about the rule of law and the culture of legality makes it a very good system and important to you and your family and your community? Now, as I said, I think there are people here who accept the rule of law and believe in the culture of legality, but are you prepared now to start to educate your fellow citizens on this subject, and children who, after all, as I suggested, are not born with knowing about what is the rule of law and why it's good for you? In fact, I would say there are many people who find it rather difficult to restrain themselves, both as children and as adults. Now, I think you would agree that there are important advantages to having the rule of law, and there are a lot of costs if you don't. And again, if you permit me, I just want to sort of run through a few of the advantages that one could use in trying to explain, persuade, and many of you are salesmen or in sales for your companies, and you are going to have to persuade people who, as General Naranjo pointed out, and I think you agree with him, that there are many people who don't see the validity or utility of the rule of law, even though it sort of specifies this in constitutions. They still don't think it works, and therefore they don't follow along with its principles. But the rule of law, first of all, provides ways, rules, and principles that provide protection and safety and stability for all the people in the society. We don't have any very other good systems that do this. The rule of law does provide this. If you don't have the rule of law, then who or what provides you safety? What you will resort to then is the rules of the fittest, the rules of the strongest in society. They will have to provide you with the protection. So the alternative to authoritarian rule or warlords or psychiatrists, warlord leaders in different areas, what will you use except the rule of law? If you don't have the rule of law, then you're going to have to submit to the rule of whoever is the strongest in your society. And so this is an important benefit of the rule of law. A second benefit of the rule of law that we take for granted, those of us who are advocates and accept the rule of law principles, is that the rule of law provides us with ways of preventing and resolving conflicts among us. The law provides ways of preventing conflict, and then if the conflict starts to develop, we have ways to resolve the conflicts without violence. A simple way through the laws and the courts system. No other way we know has this except to be under the patronage of an authoritarian leader who makes the decisions when there's a dispute amongst the people. We've developed another set of techniques to be able to do that. So when they exist, they provide us this advantage of resolving and avoiding conflict. And let's say another benefit of the rule of law is that it is a self-correcting system. The rule of law in itself provides mechanisms, rules and methods and procedures to deal with situations in our society that we regard as unacceptable. We make mistakes. We're human. Mistakes must be accepted, that we're going to make these mistakes. And so the rule of law provides us with a mechanism to correct the law, to correct the rules. It provides us with an ability to change. When we recognize the mistake, when we recognize injustice, when we recognize the rules aren't effective, there's a mechanism provided to change it. And we in the United States, as you know, now are very proud that after 100 and 200 years of abuse of some of our citizens, a significant number, and I'm talking about African American citizens, many of whom were the descendants of slaves, that we found a way through the law. And it wasn't so easy, and it took a lot of work, but we found a mechanism to be able to make this change and correct our system, correct even our Constitution, which had been accepted and were revered, and our founders who are still revered. We were able to recognize that they made a mistake. They had reasons why they made those mistakes, but they were unacceptable, and we could correct these mechanisms. And I just use this as an example of the self-corrective methods of the rule of law. Now, the rule of law does not provide for a utopia. We will continue to make mistakes, and we will continue to have some kind of technique, some kind of methods of adapting and reforming our rules and our institutions. But I'm happy to say, I think that we have developed methods which we're very satisfied with that help us do this, and these are available to all those who accept the principles of the rule of law. Now, if you don't have the rule of law, then you have to survive the law of the jungle, the law of the fittest, the law of the authoritarian rule, and you don't have these self-corrective mechanisms. But if you don't have the rule of law, then you have some of the problems also that you see here in Monterey, and I think it's one reason why people are interested now in the principles of the rule of law and a culture about it that they weren't really interested in 10, 15 years ago. You can, through the rule of law, avoid some of the costs that you're having to pay in your society and in your businesses. Crime and corruption. You know more about crime and corruption here than I do, but we've looked at some of the figures and the data, and from the business point of view and the quality of life point of view in a society, crime and corruption is taking a minimum of about 10% of the revenues of your companies. This is a macro figure for all of Mexico. I don't have exact figures for Monterey. And in fact, in my discussions with people in Monterey, I see that you yourselves have different interpretations of how bad it is. But I think most of you would accept the figures of 10% of the revenues of companies, and some of you think it's 20, and some of you think it's still growing, and it's going up in some areas up to 30% of the costs of doing business, particularly for those companies who are doing business with the government departments. You pay here also for integrity, for the lack of integrity and fraud inside your businesses, that people don't accept the restraints of the rule of law here. They haven't learned about it very much in school. They haven't seen a lot of it in society. And so they do what they can and act the way they think it's fit. And they see other people stealing from the company. They think it's normal. Not everybody, of course, but many people find that this is an acceptable way of behavior. And again, my conversations and some of the data we see about crime statistics in Mexico in generally indicate that fraud and crime inside the company is costing significant amounts. External criminals, external organizations feed off you. They're parasites on you. And they've learned how to do this quite well. And so you're having to cope with a situation, the worst kinds of things such as kidnapping and extortion that you have in your society, which may have existed a little bit in the past, but seems to have grown considerably, although maybe it's trailing off a little, but still it's at surely unacceptable levels in your society. And the continuing costs of security. You're having to buy security. You're having to pay money for security because it's not being provided by the society. It's not being provided by the system that you have now. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Now, the costs that you are enduring to your businesses, in addition to not having the overall benefits of the rule of law, but the costs in business terms, some have said to me are acceptable. We can afford it. We are a dynamic city. We have resilient businesses, and we don't like it, but we can afford it. And of course, if people believe that and they accept that, then they are making this choice. But I know it stretches the imagination, but I think it's worth stretching the imagination. Imagine how well off you would be, both materially and in terms of the quality of life locally, if you reduce significantly the crime and corruption and added significantly to your culture of legality in this society. There are many now who speculate, and again, General Naranjo referred to the possibilities, the thoughts, the ideas that people have about how good Mexico would be, how important it would be in the region, how important it would be in world terms, in global terms, if in fact you were able to develop this culture of lawfulness. Your material wealth would increase at least 10, 20, 30%, and your society presumably would benefit a great deal in other ways from this. Now, no one has a perfect culture of lawfulness. No one has a perfect rule of law. There is no society that has this on earth, and certainly not mine. And we pay the price, the costs, sometimes similar to the cost that you're enduring here every day in some parts of our country. But where the same principle would apply. Imagine what the world would be like if we could actually reduce this problem and adopt some of the principles of the rule of law that we're talking about. Now, the good news is that some areas of the world have been able to make this transformation. They have significantly reduced the costs of crime and corruption and increased the benefits and advantages of a rule of law society. I would like to turn now to the question of how they did this. And I'd like to share with you some of the research that people have done about the techniques that were used to be able to move from a culture of impunity, a culture of lawlessness, a culture in which organized crime was a major characteristic of their societies, and violence was quite commonplace, and how they were able to make the transition to a much more rule of law oriented society. One has really almost eliminated crime and corruption, but most of the others who have made this transition still have problems, and they are working to alleviate them, but they have made substantial changes. And again, it came up in some of the previous discussions this morning, but I would like to sort of focus on that. I would like to suggest to you that there's one particular way in which these societies have been able to make these changes. And the basic way they did this was the development of a partnership between the government and the people. The government and the people. They didn't leave it and think that they didn't leave it to the government or believe, the people didn't believe that the government could do this alone. They came to the conclusion that a major part of the problem were the people themselves. But they were able to then establish a partnership with usually political leaders who were elected, but also others who had grown up and became public servants in the system. My argument here would be that the way in which they did it was basically to think of the government and the people as two wheels in a cart. That the people could not do this on their own, as in one wheel of a cart, and the government could not do it on its own as the other wheel of the cart. But when the two wheels of the cart were put together, then progress was made. And I actually just made a little slide just to illustrate this, because you may not remember what this guy said to you at the end of a long morning at the conference of Coparmex, but I just want to remember the visual that I hope will appear on the screen in a minute, which is very simple, of two wheels of the cart. Now, one of the wheels, then let me take a minute to talk about these two wheels and how they did it. One of the wheels was the wheel of the government. And this wheel is the institutions, the wheel of the government institutions. The government realized that it had to develop both competent institutions, that they had the skills to do what is necessary, but also institutions with a high degree of integrity. That it wasn't enough just to have policemen who knew how to shoot, or soldiers who knew how to shoot, or public servants in different parts of the government who knew how to do the business of social development or giving out licenses and so on. They realized that they had to develop people and personnel in those agencies of government who had a high degree of integrity. Now, actually, you saw a man sitting at this podium before me, standing at this podium before me, who was one such person. And I don't think he's here now, which makes it easier to talk about him like this. But that he was one, and he talked a little bit, he was one of the people that saw this in Colombia. And I'm going to suggest this is not only true of Colombia, but I'm going to suggest it's true of some other places as well. But in Colombia, they recognized, even before Alvaro Uribe, that they had a problem with the integrity of the police. And the police leaders themselves came to this conclusion. And Oscar Naranjo was one of those leaders, not the first, he was the second, and there are now successors to him who are still working on this. I want to just tell you a little bit about what it took to do this. He talked about it, and it was correct, but what he didn't explain to you is how they did it. And I want to just explain how they did it, because it's how the same thing happened in some other places, which I'll talk about, but it's something that also I see the beginnings of signs that you are interested in doing here in Monterrey. The beginnings of signs that you're interested in doing this in Monterrey. The way they did this, he said, was through education. Education of the police. So the 150,000 now, 180,000 members of the Colombian National Police, because they're a national police system, all now have to undergo many hours of what I'll call integrity training. Not 2 hours, not a conversation about ethics. The average policeman you see in the street has undergone 40 hours of education about this. And not just lectures about being good and being nice to the population and being honest and not accepting bribes. Yes, that too. But also they go through a whole system of scenario building and training and exercises to tell them how they were going to be approached, how they'll be approached with the bribes, how they'll be tempted, and how they have to resist this, and why they should resist it, and how it benefits them and their families and the community. All of the officers of the Colombian National Police have to go through more than 100 hours of training in this. And so when you see a policeman in Colombia, now you can know that he's been trained in this. And as a matter of fact, they have to carry a card of the 5 priorities of the Colombian National Police. And one of them is, the card says on it, supporting culture of legality. And in the Colombian police stations, when you go inside, it's welcoming. It says, come inside and talk with us. We want to talk with you, and we want to talk with you about, amongst other things, culture of legality. It's a whole sort of mentality, a whole cultural shift inside the police, and it's not finished. The police now also have to be registered for how, the officers particularly, when in their professional card files of what they've been trained in, and then how they behaved when they got on the job. Did they work with the community? Were they accepted by the community? Did the community like them? Did they behave properly? And so on. And that's recorded. And so in the professional development, particularly of the officers, but also to some extent of others, there is going to be now a much higher degree of integrity. And so, as he said to you, Colombian police is given a 78% record in Colombia. He was very modest. He didn't claim that he had some credit for this, but he did. And others also worked hard to do this. It costs some money. It costs some time. There were other police officials and military guys who said, no, we have to train them better how to deal with the FARC and the criminal cartels, and we don't have time for this kind of soft stuff with the community and so on. And it was a political fight. And it's gone on, and to some extent it still goes on, because in professional development you have different arguments about what to train people in. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Naranjos and the Castros and the current leadership now have been successful in developing a new, if I can call them a new force civil inside their society, which operates nationally. Now, so I'm just giving you that one example, but you need not only the police and the military, but other public servants also have to be taught these things. And Colombia is moving in this direction, and it's not been so easy for them, but they are moving in this direction. But this is the wheel of the state. This is the wheel of the government. This is one wheel of the two-wheel cart. So you need them to be competent. They have to be efficient at their jobs, but they have to have integrity to the rule of law, to the culture of lawfulness. Without that, the cart is not going to make much progress. But that one wheel is necessary, but is not sufficient. You need the other wheel of the cart as well. And I know from my travels in this region that people say, well, it's up to the government to do all these things. And, you know, I have to do my work, and it's hard to survive in this time and so on. And so I don't have time for this myself. But in fact, if the people don't have time for it, it won't happen. The government will start, maybe, or maybe they'll just be fatalistic and just not even do anything and just talk about culture of lawfulness and rule of law. But if they start, they have to know that the people are also supportive of this. The first reason they need to know this is because, after all, it's the people who become the policemen, it's the people who become the public servants, so that the people have to actually believe in this as well. But in the places where they have been able to do this, and I haven't talked much about some of these places, I'm going to show you a short video about one of these places in a minute or two. But a place where I saw this change, it's probably the greatest quality level in the world, is in the city of Hong Kong. In the city of Hong Kong. When I first used to go to Hong Kong, it was sort of the way Bogota was 15, 20 years ago. It was the way Palermo, Sicily, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, Palermo, Sicily was. Hong Kong was a center of organized crime and corruption. The British, you remember, took Hong Kong because they wanted a place to do opium trading in China. That was in the 1840s when British imperialism. And Hong Kong continued like this, particularly after the communists came to power in China, when all the criminals came and went to Hong Kong and Taiwan. Because one of the things that communists did was to kill criminals. But so the ones who could escape went to Hong Kong and Taiwan. And there was not much rule of law. And they were able to do good business. And Hong Kong was, as I said, you could do anything, any business you wanted, criminal, not criminal, whatever you wanted to do in Hong Kong. And if you were doing not criminal, then you had to pay a lot for protection from the criminals and so on. And finally, as the British were leaving Hong Kong, they decided to try to start something new. And they were successful. And so Hong Kong is now regarded as one of the safest places in the world to be. It's one of the best business centers in the world. Maybe Singapore's, and the Singaporeans tried to copy some of the things that were done in Hong Kong also. But what that was done in Hong Kong with the people of Hong Kong is remarkable, and it continues to this day. There's a wonderful organization in Hong Kong, and it's got a website, and you can look at it. You'll only see parts of it because most of us don't read Cantonese. It's in Cantonese, but there's parts of it in English. And I encourage you, it's called the Independent Commission on Corruption, the Independent Commission on Corruption. And a number of other countries have modeled themselves on this Hong Kong, the techniques that were developed in Hong Kong. But the essence of the story was to have they had a separate unit that had police powers that could investigate corruption. I know some of you are thinking about such a law here too, but the point was they had this unit inside the government, not inside the police, as a separate unit, still exists to this day, that specializes in preventing corruption and also making sure that the police and others are following the rules. But this other thing they did was to set up an education and community department. And the principle that I'm talking about here is they decided that they needed to educate, and the people wanted to be educated about the rule of law and corruption. And so in Hong Kong, you had school children being taught about this subject. You had businessmen being taught about the subject. You had people, intellectuals and people who had moral authority in Hong Kong, people respected, because there were good writers and there were important intellectual figures in this community, they started to become involved in discussing these subjects. And finally, because there were many different sectors that they were able to mobilize, and the final one, and probably, I think probably amongst the most important, was the media. They were able to persuade the media that they had to be involved in this. And I don't mean just reporting on crime and blood in the streets and so on. They continue to do that. But there isn't much to report for them on these subjects now in Hong Kong. But what they did was they made the story of the daily struggle against corruption and crime, they made it a news and entertainment story. They turned it into something people would want to know about. And they were wanting to know about how people were struggling and how the police were winning the battle, and how in the schools what was happening to children who were involved in illegal activities at a very low level, but how other children and the teachers were struggling with them through education about this subject. And we saw these same techniques. If I had seen it only in Hong Kong, I would have said it was exceptional and so on. But we saw identical techniques half the world away, around the same time, in another city, in not a Confucius culture, but in a Southern European Catholic culture. And they developed the same techniques, almost not identical, but so similar. They adapted, each one adapted to its particular environment, but they developed these techniques that were the same as the people in Hong Kong. And this is the city of Palermo and around the city of Palermo in Sicily. The battle with the mafia is not over, as I'm going to show you in a 5-minute video. We have a much longer video, and those of you who want to see it sometime, Coparmex, I hope will maybe make it available for you if you want to see a longer one. I'm going to show you 5 minutes. But the same kinds of techniques also we found in another place, and that was in some of the cities of Colombia. And this doesn't have to do with the police. This has to do with the mayors and the city councils and parties that were feuding with each other politically, but agreed that they had to work together on dealing with organized crime in Colombia and, of course, the FARC and the ELN terrorist organizations. So I would call them terrorists, that they call themselves political organizations, and so on. These people didn't know each other. They didn't know each other, but they had developed these techniques. And so when we look at these techniques, we see that it is possible that places that were poorer economically than you are, they were poor. It's now, when you go to Hong Kong, you can't think of it that way. When you go to some of the cities that we're concerned with here, you'll see that you are richer materially than they are. They, to some extent, in some of them, they were less dynamic as entrepreneurs. You are a dynamic society in Monterey. But basically, they adopted the same techniques. Anyway, let me show you the video for 5 minutes. It's a little bit grainy. It's not perfect condition compared to what you watch now on television, but let's have a look.
For decades, Palermo has been synonymous with organized crime, corruption, and violence. Today, the capital of Sicily is the symbol of rebirth, thanks to an extraordinary process that involved political and civil leaders, members of the church, the local media, and the law enforcement community. This is a story that teaches some very interesting lessons on how civil society and elected leaders can react with success to violence and intimidation. In Sicily, organized crime, more commonly known during the 70s and 80s, the mafia escalated its activities, turning the region into an international crossroads for drug trafficking. Thousands were killed on the streets of Palermo. Many more were threatened and blackmailed. All this without any real reaction from political and civil society leaders. But during the 80s, a new movement started to take its first steps. It involved young lawyers calling for a new culture, the culture of lawfulness. Pressure from this civic movement gave strength to the most courageous journalists and editors. They started to find space for stories on the role of organized crime in the local economy, in politics, in the everyday life of Palermo. As a result, Italian politicians in Rome finally took some action, allowing prosecutors and law enforcement to fight back against the mafia. The reaction of the mafia was brutal, but the waves of violence generated the opposite reaction than the mafia expected. Major centers of moral authority came together to fight for freedom and democracy. Among the strongest voices to speak against illegality was the church. The voice of the Cardinal of Palermo resounded every Sunday against crime and corruption, followed by Pope John Paul II. He decided to personally come to Sicily to say that anyone who was a member of a criminal organization was out of the family of God. And this message was reinforced by priests at the local level who explained to citizens that there was an alternative to fear and submission. Under pressure from Sicilian and Italian citizens, the national parliament passed special laws, including the seizure of mafia-owned property and the introduction of a tough prison regime for members of the organization. In November 1993, the citizens of Palermo elected Leoluca Orlando as their mayor. Hundreds of programs were introduced to promote a culture of lawfulness in the everyday life of the citizens of Palermo. Among them, the Schools Adopt a Monument project that involved all primary and secondary school students. The project explained to youngsters that all areas of the city were the property and under the control of the citizens and not of local criminals. Another important program was conducted by Giornale di Sicilia, the leading daily newspaper of Sicily. Every day, it dedicated a full page to the school children who could submit articles and letters about the main issues in their city. This encouraged civic debate among youngsters and their families. The mayor then personally answered all of these articles and letters. This had an extremely positive influence on the whole community, demonstrating that relations with the city administration could be transparent and direct without the need of corruption and special favors. Some of the results are remarkable. Among them, the yearly murder rate in Palermo dropped from 240 in 1984 to 3 in 2000, and now it is next to none. For decades, every time a crime was committed in Palermo, law enforcement officials would struggle to find any witness willing to testify, even when the crime happened in crowded locations. Today, this doesn't happen anymore. The number of tourists has increased, particularly foreign visitors, up 87% since 1993. Organized crime is not defeated in Sicily. However, the story of the last 20 years in Palermo shows that positive results in the fight against organized crime are not utopian, even in the most difficult countries.
So as I said, that's a 5-minute version of a 20-minute presentation on some of the techniques that were used in Palermo. And the same ones, similar ones, that were used by Antanas Mockus in Bogota, or Sergio Friardo and some of his predecessors even, who are less well known, in Medellin. And now in the city of Pereira, we've seen them take these techniques and in 3 years be able to change a great deal, not everything, but change a great deal in their societies. Now, on the positive note, I see that there are people now in Monterrey who are now interested in some of these techniques. And in some parts of your city, you have actually started this kind of education inside your institutions of government and in your civil society, in the non-governmental organizations in your city. sometimes when I talk with these people, a few of whom are here today, in the room today, I ask them why they don't talk about this more with the public and with the media and so on. They just sort of, they do their part, and they don't think about it in PR terms or salesmanship terms. But for example, you have some of the best teachers in the world in your city who know this subject. I work for the Attorney General's office, and we actually have seen them go to other states in Mexico. They teach the Ministerial Publico here, nearly all of whom have been trained in this subject now. They are working with other parts of they're going to work with other parts of the state government of Nuevo León. They are working in other states inside Mexico. They've trained some people in the federal police and in the Función Pública of the federal government in Mexico City. And some of them have been in other countries, and because they're really good teachers on this subject. And they said, 10 years ago they weren't here. 5 years ago there were very few of them, but they persevered, and they're starting now to begin to develop some traction. And in your schools now, you have actually a course that's available for 7th grade in secundaria. It took a while for you in Nuevo León to think that you made the decision that you wanted to have such a course, and it's taught more or less well, but people really could enhance this course, and it could be a very important way of reaching children. You would need teachers who are prepared to teach this course, because it's not so easy. It's not that the teacher tells them how to behave. It's the teacher does what is done the example I used was the Colombian National Police. You had to discuss with the policemen why they shouldn't be corrupt, why they should make the choice for the rule of law. And if they don't make this choice consciously, then you won't have the culture, and then you won't have the rule of law. You have to have the people believing in it. And one, of course, the source of the people are the children of today, who will be the citizens of tomorrow. So I could go on and talk about a number of initiatives that are already being taken, but one of the most important to me is the beginnings of your initiative with the business sector. And to me, this is could be the most important breakthrough that you have in the developing culture of lawfulness in your city. Let me suggest to you that the business sector is diversified, and most of you know this. And so you have some companies, big companies that have great resources, and you have a lot of medium and small companies which don't have these kinds of resources. But together, the business community could be what I would call a force multiplier, not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of an educational culture of lawfulness force multiplier. You reach in your businesses, many of you, thousands of workers at a time, some big, some small, but you reach many thousands. You have suppliers you reach, and you can teach them, and you can reach them. You have your customers, and you have your communities. And if the business sector adds its voice and its emphasis to this movement for culture of legality, I think it would make a major difference. And let me, in conclusion, just say just 3 ways, practical ways, that I think that you would be able to make this difference. The first is to take a commitment inside your companies to support the rule of law. And that would mean that you would, for example, start to make legality, include legality in your codes of conduct. Most of you have codes of conduct. According to statistics, 80% of Mexican business has some sort of codes of conduct. But the question is, do you have legality inside? Do you have cultural legality inside? And the answer is usually no. So you have to include this in the code of conduct. It's not a major change, but the second step is, and that is, you would have to have a unit or a method or a section that would be able to actually ensure that the code of conduct was being followed. Now, most of the time, most people will will go along with the code of conduct for good reasons, and they believe in it and so on. But there are going to be people who don't believe it, and that you're going to have to watch out for this. And so you need some whistleblower techniques inside the company, and some enforcement mechanism in the auditing department or some sort of accounting department. Somewhere you need some kind of enforcement inside the company. I'm just on the inside of the companies. You need, I would suggest also, an educational approach inside the company. You have to talk with your workers about this. You have to talk with your managers about this. Wasn't on the subject for most business schools. It wasn't on the subject that was talked about much in society before. And so you're beginning to think about it, but you will need to have some sort of education, called bottom-up education, for all the personnel in the company. It doesn't cost a lot. It's just some sort of educational communication strategy inside the big companies as well as the others that can reach the employees, but they would see that it mattered how they behaved, and if they deviated from the code of conduct, there would be consequences, and there may be also some positive incentives for those who don't. So education working inside the company, and having a practical connection between the code of conduct and the behavior of the employees would be one way. A second way that I think you could make a contribution, one could make a contribution, is education to assist or help to assist medium and small sized companies. Some companies have a whole section that can be devoted to legality and work on this issue. But many companies wouldn't have this manpower, wouldn't have the resources to do it. They may become interested in this subject. They will see that it's in their benefit to have this legality in the society, but how are they supposed to do it inside the company? And so the proposal would be to have some sort of a help desk, have some sort of capability inside. Could be Coparmex, could be some other place in the city that helps businesses that want to develop the code of conduct, helps them talk about techniques for best practices for the enforcement of the code of conduct, and that would be a second way in which I think the business sector, could make a difference for those companies that don't have the resources to be able to do this on their own. This, by the way, is an effective practice that is sort of written up in the UN studies of promoting legality and countering crime and corruption, that many small business leaders don't have the time and opportunity to have full-time personnel on this, and therefore they need some help in what would otherwise be a difficult situation for them to deal with. And the final suggestion is demonstrate your commitment outside the company. Demonstrate that you care. You saw some examples from Palermo, that people went into the streets. I'm not suggesting the same techniques that were used in Palermo because it's different in different cities, but actually doing things and telling so people notice it, and that you care, and that it's important that people take notice. Now, some of your companies are leaders in Mexico in the subject of social responsibility. I don't know if you've ever looked at the organization that accredits companies that are acting socially responsible. There is such an organization in Mexico City, based there. And they don't discriminate about which city has companies, but they list all the companies. Monterrey is unusually highly represented in this list. Monterrey has a disproportionate number of its companies on this list who have met the standards for social responsibility, to help in the environment, help in safety, and other considerations in the community. Responsible capitalism, if you want to call it that. Now, the question is, can we add to this list of social responsibility the question of legality? Because it's not there now. You get credited for how you're dealing with the environment, or safety laws, or labor laws, and things like that, but you're not dealing at the moment with legality in that venue. So accrediting companies, fine, but also in the community. What else are you doing in the community? Not just have a good reputation, not for people to think you're doing good things, but actually helping the non-governmental organizations, working with those volunteers who want to be involved and helping them to do this. We do already see some signs of this here in your city. But one area that I would stress in the business sector in terms of the community is the media sector. If the media pick this up, you will be able to magnify the voice of what's going on in the schools and what's going on in the government in a way that it's going to be very hard to replicate. And I'm not suggesting that the media be paid to do this. I'm not suggesting that they do this only as a public service. I would hope they would do it as a public service. But I'm saying, from what we have seen and how this worked in some other places, the media could actually make money from this. It's not it's an interesting subject. People are interested in storytelling about this subject. They usually emphasize the blood and the violence, but in this case we're encouraging them to emphasize other things. They do that in Hong Kong. They do this now in Italy. Italy doesn't solve all its problems, but the media attitude towards crime and corruption has changed dramatically in Italy. I know the first person you'll come to mind if you think about it is maybe also a high figure in the media. He owns most of the media of Italy, and you know who I'm talking about. He hasn't been persuaded that the media should be involved in these things, but there are other media in Italy who have changed. One of the ways they changed, for example, just one example, they changed in their attitude towards the police, and when they changed in attitude towards the police. 20 years ago, the good guys were the criminals. Think of the movie The Godfather. Think of it, and remember who were the heroes in this story. And remember how the police were depicted in this. And I picked The Godfather because that's everyone saw The Godfather. But in lots of movies, the heroes were often the bad guys, and the police were considered stupid or corrupt or things like that. Well, in Mexico, it's sort of been a little bit like this, hasn't it? That the police are vilified when I go and have dinner in Mexican families in their homes, and I say to the children, "What are you thinking about doing?" And I say, "Are any of you thinking about becoming policemen?" Their parents are horrified that I would suggest that their children would be policemen. I try to explain. There's some policemen who are like in the movies, but there are other policemen who are different and who are kind and affectionate and actually help the community. No one's perfect, and professors are not perfect, and businessmen aren't perfect, and policemen aren't perfect, but there's a difference when policemen start to act with integrity, and the same with business people if they start to act with integrity. And so what I want to say is that business can play a major role if you choose to do that. So I thank you very, very much for this opportunity to talk about this research that we've been doing in different countries. It's really a privilege to be invited here to talk with one of the most dynamic business communities in the world. I just want you to know that if you want to pursue these things more, there are a lot of people, and some of them you know, and you had one here before me speaking, but there are lots of others who have worked with schools and the media and the church and other sectors of society who would be, I'm sure, more than willing to work with you on these matters. Again, muchas gracias, and thank you.
Damos gracias al doctor Godson por su interesante conferencia y pasamos ahora al espacio de preguntas y respuestas. Iniciamos con la primera de ellas, doctor. Dice, en México existe el fuero para miembros del Ejecutivo y Legislativo. ¿Es esto congruente con el factor esencial de igualdad ante la ley?
You know, thank you for the question, and it's right on the target. I'm a guest in Mexico, and I want to be able to continue coming here. So I'll be a little bit guarded here in my answer, but you know, I don't know enough about this law to really say it's inconsistent. But obviously, you know, we have immunities in the United States or in other countries for different officials in different circumstances. I would have to know a bit more about this to want to say I think it is inconsistent. But because we do in other countries with a medium-high degree of the rule of law, we do have immunities. But on the face of it, it does not sound consistent with the principle of equality under the law.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta dice, dentro de la cultura de la legalidad, ¿es una conducta aceptada que el Estado hostigue al gobernado que decida promover un recurso legal en contra de una ley o impuesto que considere ilegal o inequitativa?
And I'm not too sure the translation was clear in this one, but I think if the thrust of the question is the state uses the law to go after individuals for political reasons, if that's the focus of the question, then of course I think that would be inconsistent again with the principles of the rule of law. But I'm not sure I understood the question.
Lo voy a decir despacio para que el traductor lo pueda también captar y transmitir al doctor Godson. El Estado toma una actitud de hostigamiento a aquellas personas que se defienden en contra de alguna ley que consideran injusta. ¿Es una conducta aceptada? Es la pregunta.
Okay, I'm not trying to be a diplomat now, but it's very hard for me to make a comment. On the face of it, again, it seems no, it would be inconsistent. But I don't know I don't know enough about the circumstances of this. But I think the principle would be that the state should not be using the powers of the state to harass anybody unless they're violating the law. And so there has to be what we call in English probable cause. There has to be a reason why the state believes that this person is violating the law. Mm-hmm. And again, even if the state does not follow this principle, the state will make mistakes. I mean, what we don't claim for the rule of law is that it guarantees perfection or anywhere near it. It is the best system that we can devise, that man has devised, but it will make mistakes. And that's why we need this self-correcting mechanism. And that's why you need to know a lot about what is happening in different circumstances so that and if you judge that this law that you're referring to is being used in a way inconsistent with law, you can change that law, and you can change the leaders of the state. You can do many things about it. But you're asking me a level of detail of your laws which I just don't have the knowledge of.
Okay. La siguiente pregunta dice, ¿qué piensa en relación con la cultura de la legalidad sobre la aceptación o existencia de monopolios en México?
You're asking me hard questions for me to answer. I don't know if someone else could answer these questions instead of me. Again, it sounds monopoly sounds bad to me. I need to know the circumstances. I mean, all democracies have some monopolies. The state and the people decide that this is a good thing to do. When the people decide it's not such a good thing to do, they usually change this. It may not be easy, and it may be contentious, but we have a lot of problems with this issue in the United States and in Britain and any other democracies. So in general, it would strike me that you want competition, you want open markets, you want to minimum regulations, just enough to keep safety and security in mind and so on. But so in general, I would agree with I think the intent of the question, but I don't know enough about, and I do read the papers a little, so I know this is an interesting subject in Mexico, but I don't think I'm competent ready to talk about it.
Gracias. La siguiente es una pregunta un poquito más tranquila. En su opinión, ¿cuál es la mejor manera de enfrentar o contrarrestar una ley injusta en nuestra sociedad moderna?
Well, okay, this is it's an easier one. Thank you for the question. There are many ways. The first is education about how it's inconsistent with principles of justice or fairness or other principles of law that you have in the society. Unfortunately, also you have, I know you're concerned about monopolies in the media, but you do have a free press, you do have lots of ways to reach people in Mexico, and now we have the internet, and so you have lots of other ways to educate people. I think there's no scarcity of ways to educate and formally and informally and to put pressure and on wherever you think there's a wrong. And I think you're doing this more and more, not only in Mexico, but in lots of other countries. We see much more mobilization of people against what they regard as injustice. There's a decline, if I can put it, of fatalism, and people are starting to get mobilized, not just in Mexico, but I see it in Mexico, and also in the United States, even where we've had lots of protests and so on. But people are starting to move from protests to politics. They're starting to take the protest into the domain of politics, which means using the laws and the Constitution and all the tools available to them to deal with. That's sort of one of the benefits of the rule of law, that it keeps the system open. And if you have the culture that goes with it, you will have people accepting that people are going to protest. They're going to look at illegalities or injustices and try to fix them. And that's normal, and it's not exceptional. It's normal. It makes a little tension in the society. Some people might say they like the tranquility of the 19th century. It was quieter then, and now it's noisier. But people now are expressing their voices in different ways and protesting and engaging in political action when they think it's appropriate.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, al igual que en ocasiones anteriores, quedan algunas preguntas aquí sobre la mesa, las cuales igualmente le haremos llegar al doctor Godson para obtener su respuesta o opinión al respecto. Le damos las gracias al doctor Roy Godson por su destacada conferencia y pedimos a la licenciada Rebeca Betancourt Milán pasar al frente para entregar un reconocimiento al doctor Godson en agradecimiento por su invaluable participación en este foro.